You have been extremely distant all morning, my love. The fact you are trying so hard to hide it makes it more apparent.
This made him sigh, even though he had already figured as much, and was not remotely surprised she had picked up on it. He craved her attention badly, didn't he? To him it was something precious, compelling in the chaos it created and engaging in its intensity. Dynamite, gunpowder, smoldering energy waiting to pop, and all the more so from how tirelessly he tried to keep his need for it concealed, and in turn, the depths in which he tried to bury it made the experience more gratifying to her. It stroked her ego that a man like him could be so desperate for her attentiveness. The problem, of course, was that being open to her about his need for attention still felt vaguely risky. There was a certain sense of vulnerability in it that he had never quite gotten used to. Not that this was a good excuse for withdrawal, at least not anymore. If the past few months had taught him anything, it was that sharing these beliefs and sensations with her was only the real way to understand and tame them.
I'm not angry. Not exactly.
She raised an eyebrow.
But
But last night bothered me. A lot. Look, I understand why you wanted to do it, and I always knew I'd have to accept your particular way of doing things. But I still resent the way it made me feel. Do you understand?
As soon as he said this, he could see her face flicker. It was subtle, but it was definitely there, and the sight of it made it easy to guess how profoundly this disclosure had wounded her. Instinctively, he reached out to put a hand on her arm. A part of him wanted to ask her what the hell did she expect, but there was no doubt it would achieve nothing except make the situation worse. Besides, he didn't really want to. The look on her face just then had shaken him, especially knowing he was the cause, because even though it would be almost unnoticeable on anyone else, the face that it was her made it seem the equivalent of visible, dramatic distress.
I need more time. That's all. I love you. I still trust you. But I can't move on from what you did with Carly until I have had a chance to process it.
This time there was another longer pause. He wondered if she was angry with him. It was certainly a possibility. With her, the idea of his displeasure and lack of approval of her actions hardened into rage with almost terrifying ease. Even so, it never occurred to him to distance himself from her physically in that moment. And when she did finally reply, he immediately got his answer from how unusually quiet and pensive her tone was.
I understand. You are disappointed in me. I find myself extremely upset by that.
Not exactly.
He felt a bit unsettled now. He was not used to seeing her so pacifistic and couldn't quite decide how to deal with it. Eventually, he just gave a rueful smile in an attempt to lighten the mood and then nudged her foot with his.
I guess it didn't come out right.
I suspect it came out exactly as intended.
No, not really. In fact, it definitely didn't. I think I must be channeling my old priest. He used to tell me the same thing. I'm not angry with you, Angus, he'd say. I'm just disappointed.
Did he? I can't imagine you being disappointing in anything.
Well, I guess I was.
It's fortunate for him that we were not acquainted in those days. I would have killed him for saying such a ridiculous thing.
You forget, if we were acquainted, you would have probably already tried to kill me too.
She smiled at this and then reached out her hand to give his hair a quick ruffle before he could stop her.
As opposed to now when I dote on you completely.
As opposed to now, I know my human vulnerability is what you like best about me.
Maybe not the very best, although it's certainly a contender.
As she was speaking, she was starting to smile again, pulling him up against her and then wrapping both arms around his waist so she could bury her face in his chest. For a few moments he gripped onto her just as tightly, doing his best to focus on the sense of closeness. All the same, he was still the one who broke away first.
Look, I'm sorry, but I need to go. Giovanni is expecting me. I wouldn't give him a statement last night, and if I go missing now, he'll send out half of the hellbound saints in the city.
She gave a slow nod, suddenly looking rather resigned, and he hesitated slightly, then put his hand on her arm again.
Please don't follow me. Not this time. I want to know that you are here, That you are contained and to know that you are safe.
I suppose Giovanni is very concerned for your welfare.
It was clear she was not pleased about this, but at the same time reluctant to provoke him with another argument by stating the criticism outright. This sort of dynamic had pretty much become inevitable whenever Giovanni got mentioned. But whilst the previous image of the love triangle promptly came to mind, he knew it was not the right time to call her out on it. Even so, it was still hard to ignore his sudden swell of frustration. Her refusal to accept any consequences for her actions was always what led to scenes like this.
Yes. Considering what happened, he didn't really have a choice.
What else did he tell you last night?
Not much.
He was trying to keep the impatient tone out of his voice, although he was not sure how successful it was.
I left as soon as I could, so there was hardly any time. I think he was mostly just relieved. He was glad I was okay.
And now he wishes to speak with you again.
She fell silent for a few moments, a small frown furrowing between her eyebrows, as if she was envisaging the scene in her head.
Would Carly confide in you, Angus? Would you give her comfort if she asked for it?
It was true she had grown more open in the last few months, yet this level of naked insecurity was still extraordinarily out of character, and it was impossible not to be touched by it. Of course, it was also a prime opportunity for punishing her, and in the past he knew he would have taken it. But now he simply took hold of her hand instead and gave it a gentle press. It was so striking to see her allowing herself to be so unguarded around him, and he could only imagine the amount of effort it was taking to give him permission to see it.
Maybe a little. Right now I feel as if she probably needs it, but it won't be like comforting you. Not even close. Coveting you and cradling you and telling you everything is going to be okay is in an entirely different league than anything I've ever experienced.
Briefly she caught his eye, and he already knew what she was thinking. But at that moment she didn't want him to, and it made him feel sad, because whilst this was such a minor conflict compared to what had happened in the past, the depths of trust and intimacy between them had recently grown so powerful that it gave even the smallest ripple of discontent a far greater degree of significance. The whole thing was awful. He didn't think either of them was fully equipped enough to manage a situation like this. Both of them felt things so deeply where the other was concerned, yet neither had developed a truly healthy strategy to explain or express it. He now suddenly darted forward to curl his palm around the back of her neck. The grip was strong, bordering on painful. She started to frown in a silent warning that if he didn't let go she would have to make him. To his credit, he seemed to realize what he was doing and immediately relaxed the hold, gently sliding his thumb around instead to give her throat a stroke of apology.
Your expression just then was very familiar. The confused sense of hurt, the resentment. I remember it many times from years ago, and the result was always the same.
Oh yeah? So what was the result?
That you were preparing to pull away from me. I'll always remember how you used to look at me, the way you would stand and sigh and stare at the floor, or the light in your eyes when I would reward you with a scrap of autonomy, and how it felt to see you do it. Even in that very first meeting of ours. Do you remember it too? The way I said your name? There came a time when I wanted to utter your name like something sacred whenever I was at work, because my only consolation in your absence was the memory of when you were there. I'd often picture you in the months we spent apart. Florence with your friend Calvin in the Deadbeat Mall. In every image you always looked so happy that I wasn't with you.
By now he sounded incredibly soulful, and she couldn't help feeling faintly shocked at how this was far more disclosure than she ever expected him to show. Reflexively, she reached up and covered his hands with hers.
I'm not away from you anymore. I'm right here.
But you are not. You go places that I am not aware of. Secret places you don't tell me about. Not that that's surprising, I suppose. After all, I could never truly predict you, either, could I, Florence? So often you were able to move beyond my influence, and ultimately my need for you grew likewise. Just another sign of your uniqueness, that even a single look from you could instill a sense of unhappiness and longing in me, which I have no capacity to control. In my entire life, I have never desired anything as much as I desired you. I'll always remember the satisfaction of knowing I had won your trust. Something so young, wild and wary as you were back then. And so ruthless, Florence. Such a capacity for cruelty in a single look or action. You were a master of them, a true artist. Across the months, I grew accustomed to those many small torments, yet I would rather be endlessly wounded by them than to not have had you at all.
She could already hear her heart beginning to pound in her ears, because by now it had grown almost impossible to ignore how eerily similar his posture was to the way he looked when he attacked her. His expression, his voice tone, everything. She wondered if he was thinking the same. He almost certainly was, because while she might remember it so vividly, she knew he still did too. It was so bleak, wasn't it? So unnecessary. The insults, the back of his hand as she just stood there and refused to admit that she had slept with another man, more pain. Her final admission of what she had done, followed by the begs, the first time she had ever begged him, to stop. And then finally, after so much ill treatment, she erupted and attacked him, viciously and without any mercy.
We should talk more about this when I get back. I want to. Maybe I just should have hit you last night, huh? It seems I might need to get this betrayal out of my system in one way or another.
Behind him, he could feel her hand skimming up and down his spine, very slow and contemplative, like she was smoothing out fabric.
Your responses last night were what they needed to be. A reluctance to display your anger felt extremely authentic. Therefore, you should trust it.
She still sounded so sad, even though that was not what he was aiming for. He didn't want her to feel sad. He wanted her to feel reflective. He really wished she would, just once.
Then maybe I need to think of something else other than aggression to display. I'd like you to help me work out what that is, Florence.
Always.
I just have one condition, which is that I want you to do the same. We need to work together to solve this without acting like Tom and Jerry.
A part of him wanted to add, because this is all your fault. But ultimately, he didn't. It was hypocritical of him, because where he was concerned, issues of guilt and innocence were never so straightforward. She hadn't acknowledged his last statement, although this wasn't especially surprising, because she knew he primarily wasn't interested in solving things. He liked to break them instead, and then build them back up, mainly because he believed he could make something infinitely more beautiful from her shattered pieces. He gave the game away pretty early with that one, didn't he? He wanted to break her, his eyes told her, in one of their very first meetings.
Well, tough,
He thought with a sudden surge of fierceness.
tough shit. I am not destroying things. Not anymore. You're impossible, you know? You and your God complex.
She looked rather surprised by this, but he was not in the right mood to explain what he meant by it. What he was really referring to was how convinced she was of her inalienable rightness in everything. And though he had once, due to his profession, been able to counter her every moral argument, he no longer had that high ground, and therefore she presumed it was only a matter of time before he would start to see the world in the same way she did. He still thought that was the one reason she was so angry at his betrayal of her. She already knew ahead of time that he could do it, but thought he would change his mind anyway because his protection was what she wanted. And to be fair, she was eventually proven right, albeit at the very last minute. But that doesn't mean the pattern had to be a permanent one. He supposed it summed up his task for that evening. Really. He needed to make her realize that. He needed to call her bluff. Who knows, perhaps she might even be expecting it. She already knew he was capable. She said so herself. She could never entirely predict him either. She just thought she could. It was not long ago he would have dreaded this sort of soul-bearing conversation, but now he found himself anticipating it with a sense of resignation that was tense whilst also being strangely peaceful. The permission he gave her to see him as he really was. The human side, the side that could experience vulnerability. The man rather than the monster. So they would talk about what happened and their feelings. It wouldn't be the same as last time, though. No distress, no despair, no raised voices or slamming each other into walls. It would be quiet and loving with wine and candles. Then afterwards he would take her to bed because, quite frankly, they needed to have sex. It was such an important way for them to bond and feel close to each other, and they had already gone without it for much longer than usual.
I'll cook for us when you get back.
Are you really? Haven't I already been punished enough?
He was smiling as he said it, so she smiled too. And then he pretended to swipe her shoulder. She promptly swiped him back, and this time he just laughed and tugged her forwards so he could put his arms around her. She gave another of her quiet sighs and then pressed the side of his face against hers. He knew she was saying she missed him already, although it was easy to guess that she was not just referring to the meeting with Giovanni. What she really meant was how she felt she had lost him since last night, and just how badly she wanted him to come back to her again. He supposed the refusal to say it out loud was a last veneer in protecting herself, although it was still nowhere near the level of denial or defensiveness there would have been a few months ago. Besides, this was one of those occasions where she knew he would understand her. She knew he would understand her without needing to speak. Instinctively, he tightened his grip on her shoulders and leaned down to brush his lips against hers.
I love you, Florence.
Because he did, and he always would, and because in the midst of all this madness, it was the only thing that mattered anymore, and the one thing that could still be clung to. As if proving his point, his phone promptly started to ring in the background. The customized ringtone reserved exclusively for Giovanni, but this time he ignored it and continued holding on.
I love you,
he thought fiercely.
I love you so much. I want to keep what we have made together, and I won't let myself destroy it.
Giovanni's office had acquired some new furniture since the last time Angus had seen it. A few weeks ago, it was nothing but a half-empty storage room adjacent to the chapel. Proof of his occupancy was everywhere now, a fierce-looking snake plant stabbing its leaves against the window, a couple of postcards of Italy, and even a brand-new chair, shiny caramel leather. The whole thing felt vaguely ominous, because it suggests the office was no longer a temporary hub, but a permanent nerve center. It was not like any of it really mattered, though, or was even all that interesting. Yet he still found himself studying it anyway, namely because it gave him a reason not to listen to Giovanni and his endless stream of questions about Florence. It was like he was genuinely hungry for them, almost insatiable. Every word, every gesture, every facial expression. It was as if he wanted to mentally place himself in the alleyway for a chance to confront her too, even if the showdown's already over by now, and can only ever happen in his head. Just as he was thinking this, Giovanni leaned back in his chair, lurking away with all the gloomy magnificence of Lincoln sat in his monument, then proceeded to emit a series of elaborate sighs and scowls, as Carly explains yet again how Florence did nothing to threaten them in any way. Sigh. Stayed for less than 5 minutes? Scowl. And strongly implied Florence would like to contact Angus again in the future. The last statement prompts a set of jealous scowls that were so intense they looked physically painful. So Angus sighed instead and followed it up with a melancholy shrug, for good measure. Giovanni then shrugged as well, as if engaged in a wordless competition over which of them could be the most jaded. But this time Angus just numbly stared back at Giovanni as he was gripped with yet another urge to simply walk away and leave him shrugging and scowling to an audience of one. Angus had barely said a single thing the entire time he had been there. He was completely checked out by this point, and it was obvious that Carly and Giovanni both knew it. Fortunately, it was safe to say that they would be attributing this to stress rather than any other sinister motives. It would be easy enough to believe, he supposed, because he certainly fit the part. He caught a glimpse of himself in the men's room earlier, and he looked like utter shit. It was as if his concern and frustration about Florence had been etched all over his face.
She wasn't anything like I imagined.
She, of course, meant Florence and Angus now started listening with renewed interest to see what Carly was going to reveal. People imagine Florence in so many different ways, don't they? A big composite of separate identities, none of them ever entirely capturing the whole. Carly also sounded slightly reluctant, and Angus couldn't help feeling she was only saying it at all because she had exhausted her other observations and was dredging around for something new to satisfy Giovanni's ferocious curiosity and obsession.
She was more kind, I guess. Restrained? I don't know.
Carly hesitated, and then glanced at Angus as if she was hoping he would help her out.
I can't think of the right word to describe it.
You wouldn't be the first person to think that, and it's a total facade.
He scowled at both of them and then paused himself, just long enough to let his breath thunder out of his body in a long, angry rumble.
Fake innocent charm is one of the classic hallmarks of a higher demon. They will be polite to you 1 minute and then be ripping you apart, limb from limb the next.
Carly flinched slightly.
Yes, Padre Pacha.
She sounded very calm, although Angus couldn't help suspecting that she had been stung by his tone. Not that he would blame her. By this point, Angus was so used to it, he barely even noticed it anymore. But there was no denying that getting on Giovanni's bad side as a seminarian could be a genuine ordeal.
I suppose it was just surprising. Reading about demons is one thing. It's another to see them in real life.
Giovanni shifted backwards and forwards in his chair. Angus could already see he felt guilty for snapping at her, but of course, being Giovanni, still doubled down on it anyway.
Then I hope you will use this as a learning experience. Never, ever forget what she is.
I know exactly what you mean, Carly.
Angus joined in partly because he was sick of all this, but also because he felt that Giovanni was being a total dick for the sake of it.
And for what it's worth, I think she liked you for being so respectful.
Giovanni emitted an irritable grunting noise, and he suddenly felt bad for Carly, placed in the unenviable position of trying to keep them both happy, like a kid stuck between warring parents. Possibly Giovanni thought the same because he now made a curt, swooping gesture at her with his hand as an indication she could leave. Carly politely dipped her head in response, and then began to gather up her bag. Angus couldn't help sensing she was relieved at an excuse to get out of there. He knew he would be if he was her. Giovanni waited until she had gotten to her feet and then leaned back in his chair again.
By the way, Schreier, I meant what I said. You did excellent work. Last night was impressive. Truly, you are a credit to the Vatican.
Angus immediately started to nod, which meant Giovanni and him were now united again. Divorced parents cheering from the sidelines as their offspring scored a home run. Admittedly, he was also having a private cringe to himself at such a worthless reward as being called a credit to the Vatican, although at least Carly seemed happy enough. As she closed the door behind her, Giovanni let out another rumbling sigh and then narrowed his eyes slightly as a sign he was giving Angus his full attention. Angus made a grunting noise in acknowledgement, so Giovanni obligingly responded with a sigh of his own, which immediately made Angus wonder if they were destined to sit here, grunting and snorting at each other like a couple of cavemen for the remainder of the meeting. Then Angus leaned back himself and shuffled irritably at the discomfort of the hard chair kept for visitors. The clock on Giovanni's desk seemed exaggeratedly heavy on every other beat. Tick-tock, tick-tock. And the relentless drone in the otherwise silent room was already setting his teeth on edge.
So,
Angus raised his eyebrows. A part of him wanted to demand, "So what?" and had to force himself not to.
how are you doing?
Angus shrugged slightly.
I've been better.
I can imagine. Last night must have felt very intense.
Briefly, Angus caught Giovanni's eye and then leaned a little further backwards, steepling his fingers beneath his chin as he went in a thoughtful, rather pensive gesture.
Yes, that would be one way of putting it.
Giovanni nodded in response, reflectively leaning forward in his chair.
From what Carly told me, she could barely take her eyes off of you. It is obvious the old tension between you both hasn't died down.
I suppose not.
Do you think she misses you, ex-chief minister?
In a way.
Angus shrugged.
I think she misses having a worthy adversary.
And what about you? Do you miss her?
This time Angus waited a few seconds before giving him a long stare from over his fingers.
We were constantly trying to corrupt and eliminate the other, Giovanni. What do you think?
I think it is not as simple as that.
Angus immediately barked out a laugh. It was incredibly dry and humorless. From the corner of his eye he could see Giovanni flinch. Possibly Angus seemed slightly unhinged, but renouncing Florence over and over was starting to upset him, and this brittle, angry facade was the only way he could think of trying to hide it.
Are you trying to warn me, Giovanni? Are you worried she's going to bat her eyelashes at me, and I will come running to her side after tender promises of love and affection?
For a couple of beats, Giovanni just stared at him in silence. Angus wondered whether he was remembering Elijah's cryptic comments about Angus's consistency and loyalty, the pure vindication of Elijah's tone. Angus was sure he had. How could he not? He's probably got Elijah's voice in his head.
I am not the only man that she has bewitched.
It seems that she is already trying to corrupt you.
She never stopped. So what else is new?
Giovanni exhaled rather heavily, and then to Angus's surprise leaned across the desk to plant his hand on his arm.
There was always something extraordinary between the two of you. I get that, ex-chief minister, and I get why it took you a while to get round to executing her at the time. You wanted to exorcise her and then give her a chance at redemption, like we are trained to do. I know the Church didn't always do the best job of supporting you in these areas. The Pope should have taken matters into his own hands and seen to the execution himself. It was too much responsibility to put on you.
He opened his mouth to reply, and then caught Giovanni's eye, and promptly finding himself closing it again. Of course, this was the sort of statement that was impossible to answer without being either rude or disingenuous. But he supposed it was not like it really needed one. After all, Giovanni was convinced that Angus must have been out of his depth, and that suited Angus just fine.
It is sometimes difficult to remember that underneath the cassock we are still human beings.
Giovanni glanced at Angus again, this time slightly beseeching. It was as if he wanted Angus's absolution, even though it seemed a bit late for that now. Angus wasn't in any position to offer forgiveness to anyone, was he? Not to him and not to himself.
The Vatican overestimated your ability to deal with such a witch. In general, they felt you were becoming too compassionate on the pagans, and they thought I was best placed to help you. They thought that we would run rings around each other and then eventually settle down to find some sort of common ground. That my presence was serendipitous in the arrest of Empusa and to help guide you in her interrogation, trial, and execution. Although it seems that she outsmarted us both in the end and escaped alone with her head still intact.
Not alone. You escaped with me.
He thought bleakly. That was the problem. A problem with a life-altering solution, of course, but still one that needed months of pain and misery to get there. In the end, Angus just shrugged like he was inviting Giovanni to continue, despite the fact he really didn't want him to.
You ever heard the proverb about the two wolves?
Angus threw Giovanni another glance and then blinked a few times.
No?
It's about an old man talking to his grandson. He's explaining the internal conflicts we all have and how it is like a battle between two wolves, one evil and one good. The kid asks which wolf wins, and the grandfather tells him, the one you feed the most.
For a few moments, Angus just stared at him, thinking rather hysterically that if most people have two regular wolves, then him and Florence had two wolves with samurai swords and rabies.
What's your point, Giovanni?
Several points. I guess I am trying to apologize on behalf of the Vatican for not helping you sooner with the Empusa situation, for pretending not to see her, for not helping you stop her. She had been whispering in your ear for a long time and trying to feed the bad wolf in you, Angus, and you had no one to help you fight her back. I was there, trying to help, of course, but you should have had the Pope in your corner, and you didn't. You had to try and stand your ground mostly by yourself.
There was another pause. Angus glanced at him again, then raised an eyebrow.
And
Giovanni gave a rather crooked smile.
You're exhausting to talk to ex-chief minister, do you know that?
I've been told.
Well, can you just pretend not to be as smart as you are for a few minutes and let me get this out? I'm working my way up to it. The thing is, I have a statement I need to pass on to you.
Giovanni caught Angus's eye and then let out a sigh that was even longer and wearier than any of the others.
The thing is that I understand how easy it would have been to let her coerce you. Despite your strength and resolve, she was a gorgeous. She was the forbidden fruit which would have had any religious man doubting his faith, no matter who they were. And the Vatican is sorry that we let you be in a situation where you may have had no other option available than to submit to her. So, if anything did happen in New York, between the two of you, the Vatican would be inclined to forgive any minor indiscretions in this instance, because it felt you did not have the full support of your superiors.
This time Angus's only response was to stare at him in numb silence, battling with a powerful surge of emotion as he tried and failed to find the right words to respond. What could he possibly say? Jealous Giovanni being forced by his boss to probe into whether Angus's resolve crumbled in a moment of weakness in front of the blonde-haired seductress. They were sniffing around some leftover stench of the truth, but so far from the source, it was still laughable. They were hedging their bets and making sure that he wasn't deliberately hiding information for fear of rebuke. And then he thought of her, the other of the two wolves, of the expression on her face this morning, and of the growing distance between them that somehow he still needed to find a way to breach.
Hey, you okay? This isn't an accusation, it's just a reminder that if you were afraid to divulge anything, then you needn't be, that the Pope has your back.
Angus cleared his throat and then blinked a few times. How long had he been sitting there, staring at nothing? He wasn't even sure. Giovanni was terrified that Angus would admit to being seduced. That much was obvious. The jealousy that he so badly tried to hide.
No, nothing happened. She tried several times and I resisted.
Giovanni gave a sigh of relief and got up from his desk so he could walk around behind him and lock the office door. Angus watched his progress in silence, confused as to what the hell was going on, until it finally dawned on him that Giovanni was going to divulge about his own personal weaknesses when it came to Florence, and he didn't want to be disturbed by any seminarians.
Coffee?
No, thank you.
How about something stronger?
No, but thank you, though. Do you need a minute alone?
A lot longer than one. No, it's okay.
I didn't mean you should leave. I wasn't going to throw you out of your own office.
You can if you want. I mean, look at it. It's not as if I like being here.
You want to talk about Impusa?
As soon as Angus asked this, he found his thoughts racing back to her. Of her face, her expression, of her sadness this morning, and the sound of her voice.
I want you to come back to me.
This was awful. He wasn't sure how much more he could take.
Don't you dare mention how much you lusted after her yourself, or how you felt like she was trying to coerce you.
He thought to himself fiercely.
Not about Empusa, no.
Understood. I can't say I blame you, but if you change your mind, well, you know where I am.
Angus sounded very sincere, but he was relieved by this outcome. After all, Angus did not want to talk about Florence either, at least not in these terms. He didn't want to dwell any longer on his own sense of guilt and regret, the lost opportunities for what might have been in the past. But more than anything else, he knew that Giovanni didn't want to accidentally humanize her. Acknowledging how much power she had over them both, as men, meant acknowledging that they had shown weakness to the staring eyes and the serpent's smile. And it went without saying that this avoidance suited him just fine. In the end, he just jerked his head towards the collection of clippings and photos on the opposite wall, Il Impuro's latest handiwork, displayed in all its blood-soaked gore and glory, in what's little more than a final, urgent attempt to change the subject.
It's been a while since the last raid. You must be expecting to orchestrate another one soon?
Maybe in another week or so, if he sticks to the same pattern, which, let's face it, he probably won't. Probably resents Empusa upstaging him.
Do you want my advice on anything? I think it's fair to say I've taken my eye off the ball with this one.
Giovanni shrugged,
No one would blame you, ex-chief minister. It was not like you haven't had more important things on your mind. And besides, there is no new leads from last time. The trail's gone cold again. It is the same double bind it always is. Unless he causes some form of violence or trouble, there is no more evidence.
And so we wait.
We wait. It's an odd case. It is like you said. There's something really off about him.
There is always something fundamentally off about pagans.
But this one is so unpredictable, don't you think so? It's the way his MO keeps shifting. 1 minute it is drugs, next prostitution, then murder.
I know, but I've never cared about that as much as you have. For me, it's not the how or the why, but how we catch and rebuke. That is a transformation. We make beauty out of ugliness, righteousness from sin.
You sound a bit like you missed the hunt.
Maybe I do. At least it was definitely a motivating factor in why I became a minister judge. It sounds like El Impuro almost got caught once, and so maybe he's trying to be more slippery this time. He has experience.
I'd have to agree with you there. That also crossed my mind. So, what do you think El Impuro's deal is?
The disparity of crimes, the vast network is the most interesting thing about him. He has power and influence over the population of pagans.
Go on.
Well, most vice syndicates have a specialization, don't they? Like you said before, drugs, prostitution, illegal abortion, homicide, or political or religious corruption. El Impuro seems to have a hand in everything. The only thing the crimes have remotely in common is they have happened in Mexico City. For all we know, there could be 18 separate El Impuros running around. It wouldn't be the first time that's happened. I remember a case in the late 40s in Nashville. A similar codex of identities was used to mask the real perpetrator.
We have considered it.
Well, consider it again. Dig into the backgrounds of any of those pagans you have arrested that pertain to operate for him. You might find some link they have in common. A school or university, maybe?
Or a parish?
Possibly. I was thinking he easily could have been defrocked, but he might still have a religious fixation. He might be seeking the same type of control and power he had before that happened. A bit like Elijah Jenkins.
That's not funny, ex-chief minister.
I wasn't laughing. I'm using him as an example. He could be some kind of middle ground ex-chaplain who has decided he could use some devoted followers in a new type of flock to give some meaning to his life. Anyway, we have been focusing exclusively on the perp, and it might be the actual crimes that hold more clues than we realize.
Larger vice syndicates get lucky like that. Crimes committed for convenience without a personal link. It means the emphasis always circles back to them. Not bad for an afternoon's work, ex-chief minister. I should have had you on this investigation full-time, shouldn't I?
You tried, remember? I didn't want to. Besides, everything I've just described could be wrong. It is only an impression. It's not really based on anything.
Well, it's a solid impression.
He sounded so earnest, and it made him realize how this was something he had always appreciated about the role of chief minister, how people never showed any signs of resentment or envy if he found a perpetrator before they could. Some idiotic insubordinates like Luis would sometimes begrudge him the smallest sliver of success or intelligence, but it was drowned out by his fellow clergymen who actively enjoyed it. All they cared about was getting the job done. That was how he was trained to be valued. The only way he had been trained to be valued, unlike with Florence, who valued the entirety of him. As Angus stared back, he was aware of another fierce wave of affection for his profession. Only this time it was equally followed by a fierce wave of sympathy, because it was likely one of the last times he would ever get to feel this way. As Angus continued to stare, Giovanni now returned his gaze, smiling and fond like an old family friend. Giovanni was glad that they had this talk together, wasn't he? He thought it had cleared the air, made some small attempt to atone for the many mistakes and sins of the past. But all it's really done is to remind Angus of that strange displacement he experienced last night, of that anguished sense of the two selves, one old and one new, one good and one bad. Two souls, alas, are dwelling in my breast, and one is striving to forsake its brother, because Giovanni thinks he is talking to the old self, and if he could, he knew he'd be so glad to just give it to him. He would get up now and quietly tiptoe away, leaving it alone behind him to talk with Giovanni in peace. This was the self who would have carried on working through the night to help him catch Il Impuro. It would have been devoted and tireless, gritting his teeth through the pain, and afterwards it might have even gone for a meal with Carly to introduce her to Lisa. Although really, who knew for sure what that version of him would have done? It was not him anymore. He couldn't entirely say. And besides, whilst it might be an appealing fantasy, he knew deep down that it would never have worked, because that type of life was driving him to drink and plummeting him into depression. Then she came along, and she fed the big bad wolf. He supposed it was inevitable, really. Maybe his bad wolf was just waiting for her to come along, like the one in Little Red Riding Hood. He could analyze it all in his mind 100 times. His wrath, his lust, his violence, her innocence, her stubbornness, her pureness, their conflicts, their fights, the screams, yells, tears, and intense emotion, like static electricity sparking in the air, and then her seeing through his broken shards and putting the pieces together, his declaration of love, her seduction, their passion, his sacrifice, her freedom, his bitter heartache, her rearrest, his rage and fury at her, and finally her declaration of love, a Valentine for a broken man. And he knew now that he did not have it in him to ever betray her, and even more than that, he knew he had no real power to stop whatever her intentions were on Giovanni, Jacob, Christopher, or even Carly.